Old Orchard Beach, Maine, a town known for its summer tourism and strong ties with Canadian visitors, is facing an unexpected economic shock. Sterling Morse, owner of the Point of View Inn, reports losing up to 90% of his business, an outcome he attributes directly to political tension sparked by recent U.S. trade policies. Morse's Inn, a family-run business for 5 decades, has long served French-Canadian families who return each summer like clockwork, booking the same rooms year after year. But this year, those familiar names are gone. The cancellation started after the announcement of President Trump's 25% tariff on Canadian imports in February 2025 and escalated in response to increasingly confrontational rhetoric toward Canada.
This has been a family business for 50 years. You got to take into the fact how the Canadians perceive this, and they are incredibly pissed off.
We met Sterling Morse in Old Orchard Beach, Maine. He owns the Point of View Inn, which is only about 150 miles from the Canadian border.
We have been here.
He says the majority of his regular customers are French Canadians.
Very traditional people, families that take the same room, the same dates every year.
Not this year. Sterling says most of his Canadian customers have canceled, fed up with President Donald Trump's antagonistic rhetoric toward Canada. There's the threat of tariffs, too, and lately Trump has suggested redrawing the border between the two countries.
It's affecting at least 90% of my business.
Are you saying you've had 90% of your business canceled this year?
Easily.
Point of View Inn?
During our visit, yet another Canadian called to cancel.
Listen, monsieur, you don't need to explain anymore.
This is every registration card from last year. This is the Canadian. That's my American. This just went away.
That's all you got now. That doesn't pay the bills.
Does not.
Best of my ability. For Sterling Morse, it all snowballed shortly after Donald Trump's inauguration.
All of a sudden an email pops up. It's almost like, your phone, ding, ding, slow ding. People that have been here for 35, 40 years. You recognize that number. It's like, I know why they're calling. And the anger is, in my eyes, incredibly justified.
Here in Old Orchard Beach, roughly 40% of the tourists come from Canada, according to the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber's executive director told us that those tourists make up about 30 to 40% of the revenue for many of the businesses here.
I think we're still kind of seeing how many different industries this impacts. It doesn't just impact tourism, of course.
Over at the Alouette Beach Resort, owner Fred Kennedy hasn't seen a cancellation yet, but he's heard an earful from his Canadian customers.
What are they telling you?
Well, their feelings are basically hurt. They don't like to be referred to as the 51st state, and they feel that they just want to express themselves in sort of a nationalistic way. As a innkeeper, hotelier, I'm concerned with losing any guests. I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that things will resolve themselves as time goes on.
Old Orchard Beach is a seasonal town, so businesses have about 12 to 15 weeks to make their money for the entire year. Back at the Point of View Inn, Sterling Morse doesn't see any way he can make up that lost revenue this season.
You got to start thinking about the end game. The end game of 50 years of tradition, to be honest, yeah.
Like you would consider closing down, selling?
There may be no choice.
Sterling Morse, the inn owner who says he lost 90% of his business, went to school in Montreal and feels a real kinship with Canadians. He told me that their anger is justified and he appreciates their renewed sense of nationalism. He also told me that he has tried to convince some of them to change their minds and to come anyway, but he says they are standing firm with Canada. Randy Kay, CNN, Portland, Maine.
The facts on the ground are clear. Old Orchard Beach, where nearly 40% of tourists are Canadian, has seen a massive drop in foreign visitors. The town's economy, largely dependent on a tight 12 to 15-week summer season, is straining. Local business owners, including Fred Kennedy of the Alouette Beach Resort, note that even those Canadians who haven't canceled yet are expressing a deep emotional response. Many are offended by Trump's perceived dismissiveness, especially the suggestion that Canada is effectively the 51st state. These aren't isolated feelings. Former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, during a news conference on March 4, accused Trump of attempting to collapse the Canadian economy in a move that, in his words, resembles annexation in all but name. This sentiment, paired with rising nationalism in Canada, has created a sharp backlash, economic and symbolic, that crosses borders. From a policy perspective, Trump's decision to impose tariffs is framed by the White House as a national security measure, designed to address cross-border threats including illegal immigration and drug trafficking, especially fentanyl. The administration's justification rests on the belief that Canadian oversight is insufficient, and economic pressure is necessary to compel cooperation. The policy was met with domestic support in some conservative circles who argue the U.S. must prioritize sovereignty and reassert control over its own trade terms. Yet these national imperatives come with collateral damage. Morse's experience is emblematic of a larger dilemma: how federal decisions, made with macro goals in mind, often land heavily on local communities. The emotional and financial toll isn't just measured in dollars lost, but in the unraveling of traditions, relationships, and livelihoods built on trust and mutual respect. Morse, who studied in Montreal and feels a strong bond with Canadians, expressed understanding for their decision. "The anger is, in my eyes, incredibly justified," he told CNN. "This just went away," he added, pointing to stacks of registration cards from his once loyal Canadian clientele. This moment opens a door for reflection on several levels. On the surface, it invites a debate about trade policy, national interest, and the economics of tourism. But more deeply, it raises questions about how nations conduct dialogue with their allies and the cost of dismissing long-standing relationships. The story of Morse is not just economic, it's psychological. It's about how identity, loyalty, and emotional bonds are formed and fractured in the wake of geopolitical decisions. These themes, human complexity, emotional logic, cultural sensitivity, demand more than surface-level political analysis. They require the kind of thorough, constructive dialogue that unpacks root causes and acknowledges moral trade-offs. In this light, the question isn't simply whether Trump's policies are right or wrong, but how well they balance strategic national goals with interpersonal, cross-border realities. Political rhetoric, particularly in contentious times, can sometimes spiral into oversimplification. But the human mind is not a blunt instrument; it responds to nuance, tradition, and perceived injustice. When a Canadian family cancels a beloved vacation because they feel insulted or dismissed, their action becomes more than a boycott. It is a form of psychological self-defense, a statement about respect and reciprocity. Their cancellation is an act of identity and agency. The challenge lies in acknowledging these dynamics without undermining national interests. Trade and security policies must be firm where necessary, but clear, careful communication is essential. The role of free speech, in this context, is not to inflame but to clarify, to invite scrutiny, critique, and ultimately understanding. The balance between assertiveness and diplomacy must be constantly re-evaluated. Dialogue must remain open, even confrontational at times, if it serves truth-seeking rather than scoring rhetorical points. Morse's attempt to reason with longtime customers is an example of how individual citizens can become informal diplomats, appealing not to nationalism, but to personal connection and mutual appreciation. There is also an opportunity here. Crises reveal the edges of systems and the fragility of assumptions. By confronting uncomfortable truths, whether about economic interdependence, emotional fallout, or strategic miscalculations, societies can adapt and refine their approach. This is where intellectual humility enters, the recognition that even well-intentioned actions can yield unintended consequences, and that re-evaluation is a strength, not a weakness. The broader conservative challenge is to integrate national vision with local empathy, economic logic with human narrative. The tradition of valuing free markets, secure borders, and national pride must also make space for the values of stability, trust, and interpersonal respect. As history unfolds, those who engage deeply, reflect honestly, and speak clearly will shape a more sustainable future. In the end, Morse's story may not change national policy, but it forces a reckoning. It illustrates the quiet cost of loud politics. And it shows, with heartbreaking clarity, how easily the intangible bonds of goodwill can be severed when communication fails, even, especially, between friends.